Volume 2 Chapter 38. King Ramposa's face was drawn and ashen. His fingers shook so much that they rattled the paper on which the words were written. Everything was looking up. He thought with utter despair. 8 Fingers was broken. The heads of their leaders sat on top of pikes at the gates of the capital. A caster at hand who may have had the power to defeat the empire. Now this. He set the rattling, shaking paper down on the table. One bad thing after another had happened in the span of little more than days. Sire, what do we do? If the Adventurers Guild refuses to undertake any quests for any members of the royal faction, then we won't have a faction? Marquis Revan shuddered at the thought. That is bad. Princess Rena replied, but my brothers, and the peasant rebellion. That is worse. My sons. Both of them. The king could no longer read the document put together from survivor testimony. The hated ink grew blurry through his pooling tears, while bitterness filled his voice for more reasons than one. Word of Prince Barbro's abuses and corruption spread like wildfire, even without the documented proof. The use of an 8 Fingers contract purchase to pretend to abuse an adamantite-ranked adventurer made it easy to draw the correct conclusion. And all the king could do was sit in private with his few trusted advisors, and wallow in despair. My son, Barbro. He cost me much. But I would have preferred he lived, and cost me more. The king's head slumped. He was wrong. You don't have to tell me that, Gazif. The king did not meet the look he knew his head warrior was giving him. But he was my son, and bad as he was, I loved him. And Zaynak. He would have been a good king, if only he hadn't been killed. His hand drifted over the documents arrayed on the desk, next to the one informing him of his son's demise in the Declaration of Independence for the Kingdom of Khani sat reports of the places they'd taken. Several minor noble houses had been exterminated already, a number of towns, villages, and Irantal even surrendered without a fight. Beside that, sat the document from the Empire, declaring their annual war. What can I even do? King Ramposa asked. He was at a loss. Neither Gazif nor Revan had an answer. His last remaining child, however, did. Father. There is only one course of action. Rena put her hand over his and looked up into his face with her loving, warm blue eyes. My brothers. She blinked back tears. My brothers are gone, but the kingdom remains. The nobles won't send an army to fight the empire when the rebels are hanging entire houses. They can't even if they wanted to. We have to stop the rebellion from swallowing us in pieces. Master Gaon is ready to declare the existence of his kingdom and warn the empire to steer clear. Let him do that, and then, we gather the noble houses together, all of the noble faction, and go to fight the rebels. Slaughtering the people of my kingdom doesn't sit well with me, Gazif remarked with a sullen look. If they only knew the king I know. But they don't. Marquis Revan pointed out. And there's no way they want to now, between everything that has happened with Prince Barbro, the guild, and now this. I don't propose we go fight to win the battle, I propose we go to fight to win the war. Princess Rena said, and the 3 men looked at her. Even her father's face of mourning vanished in the confusion. As the princess laid out her plan, the faces of her father, the Marquis, and Gazif, first turned ashen, then intrigued, and finally, as she spoke and argued as gently as she could, resigned. 1/3 of Riastais will be lost. Her father replied at last. If we don't cut off the arm, the whole body will die. We can have 2/3 of our kingdom, or none of it. And at the end, father, you know you will have to step down. A new ruler will be needed, Rena said and gently laid her hand on his arm. Let our kingdom's great renewal be your legacy. Not the things my oldest brother did. If you go out the right way, then you can spare him that shame. Please. Father, let me help you. Rena wiped tears away from her eyes, and the king finally gave a somber, silent nod. It took weeks for it to happen. The nobles were slow to heed the call at first, and village after village joined the rebellion. The Wolf King and Wolf Queen ate up territory and captured noble houses were hanged from their own towers. Small engagements left more weapons and armor in the hands of the rebellion, and made the kingdom of Khani seem unbeatable. But the call was answered. Tens of thousands of levied soldiers and household retainers, along with the heads and entire families of the noble houses, came together at the capital. Father, is it really necessary for you to go yourself? Rena asked while her shaking hand caressed the back of his own, her eyes lingering up at him, worry filling her face. Yes, my daughter. I am the king. I do what needs to be done. I sacrifice what I must sacrifice for the greater good. And that means I must put myself at risk. King Ramposa said, his voice weaker than Rena had ever known it. He was clear in his determination. Covering her hand with his own, he looked down at her for a long moment of reflection. Daughter, Rena, you were more than I knew you to be, and I regret not seeing it until your brothers were gone. King Ramposa laughed bitterly. Not to worry though, I will make up for lost time when I come back. We'll set everything right, and restore our kingdom to what it used to be. Yes, father, I can hardly wait. Rena replied, and flung her arms around him in a tight embrace. The hardness of his armor and the softness of his royal cape that hung down at his back were at odds with one another, but the warmth of his kiss to her forehead was real, clear, and utterly sincere. Rena's pure white dress was long and flowing, and though in heels, she had to rise to her tiptoes to kiss her father's white bearded cheek. At least take Gazif with you, father. She pointed a few feet away where Climb stood dutifully in the wings. I have my Climb to protect me. I don't want you to go out there into danger without some assurance that you'll come home. Very well, Rena, very well. King Ramposa III said with an aching heart as the worry from his youngest living child for himself warred against his worry for her. Just assist Marquis Revan as best you can, and I'll go end this once and for all. As you say, father. Rena answered and broke her tight embrace, removing herself to the side of her bodyguard. Protect my daughter, Climb. She is all I have left. King Ramposa said with a deep well of sorrow still roiling in his guts. Climb immediately went down to one knee and bowed his head to swear loud enough that it echoed off the stone walls of the palace. Majesty, no one will touch her unless they've killed me first. I believe you, the king said, looking the blonde boy over, clad in the armor the princess had scrimped and saved to give to him. Having clear eyes and a hard, handsome look about him, nearing manhood, the boy was always diligent, hard-working, loyal and devoted. The poor boy, in love with my daughter, but this was all he could ever do. If he'd been born a nobleman, he might have made a fine match, he might even have been a worthy king. But it simply isn't meant to be. King Ramposa reflected with a sense of pity for the young Climb. Send word to Gazif that I will bring him after all, and tell him to hurry, we're leaving soon. The king said, and then walked away without looking back. Emperor Jerkniv sat in his private council chamber. Is this a joke? He asked, rolling up the document and shaking it like a stick. I'm afraid not, my boy. Fluda replied. I checked it out myself. The kingdom has ceded part of its lands to a magic caster named Ainzul Gaun. He is a true caster and bested a theocracy scripture unit some months ago. Jerkniv frowned, unrolled the document and read it again. To the Emperor Jerkniv of Baharuth, let it be known that on this 14th day of the month, the kingdom of Nazarick is named into being. Also, we enter into a state of war in support of our ally, the kingdom of Riastais, and in retaliation for the military attack upon our lands by your workers on your government's order. You are advised not to march your army to the Katza Plains, and to instead offer modest recompense for your offensive conduct against both kingdoms. If your army appears, we will take land and lives instead of simply coins. Jerkniv stopped reading and crinkled the paper up and threw it hard against the floor. The blonde hair and fine features of the young emperor grew tight and his teeth ground against one another in uncharacteristic anger. Does he really think he can do what he says? I believe so, my boy. Fluda stroked his beard and approached the sovereign he'd helped to raise. Will you give in? Of course not. Jerkniv shot to his feet and kicked the paper off into a corner. Defeating a scripture is no small feat, but still, even if he can kill 5,000 by himself, there's nothing he can do against 20,000 knights. He may have an army of his own. Remember, he did eliminate hundreds of workers that tried to enter his home. Fluda remarked, and Jerkniv stopped to think about what the old man said. That is a fair point. We'll pull 10,000 from the swamp area where the frogmen live to hold in reserve, just to be sure, Jerkniv said. We still have time to prepare, and with that peasant civil war being what it is, they'll be weakened anyway. This should be the last great kick before we've knocked down the whole rotten structure of the Riastais kingdom. After this, next year we should be able to start just taking up territory and purging any problematic elements. A true new empire is about to dawn on the world, Fluda said with a voice full of wonder. What marvelous magics it will birth, I can hardly wait to find out. Fluda shivered with excitement as the meeting ended, and the magic caster departed the company of the Bloody Emperor. Ainz spun with his sword and cut straight through the towering fire elemental. Day after day, hour after hour, he kept grinding away, killing the powerful summoned monsters of his subordinates, driving his exp ever higher. When he wasn't at it himself, the recruited members of Foresight were at it with aid from Sabos, who steadily secured them victories that were impossible on their own. However, where for them it was simply a chore to be done, but when the last summoned beast vanished and Ainz removed his helmet to wipe the sweat from his brow, he knew that for himself it was something more. "Is something wrong, my lord?" Lupus Regina asked, holding out a tray with a silver cup and a silver pitcher of cold water beside it. "Yes," Ainz replied abruptly and took the cup from the tray to quaff down its contents. The ice-cold water was deeply refreshing. "It is so much easier to grind in games, you never get tired." He teased himself a little, and when Lupus Regina poured again, he drank that immediately too. "Master, if I can help," the red-haired battle maid suggested. "Fine," he said. The urge to get it off his chest was such that, even knowing Lupus Regina's nature, he didn't care. He set the cup down on the tray and once again she poured, sloshing cubes of ice into the cup with tiny little clacking noises as it filled. Ainz took the cup and resumed drinking, and jabbed his sword into the sands of the arena so that the hilt was pointing straight up. "It's my humanity. I'm going to have to go out and kill a great many people. Maybe if I was still undead, I wouldn't feel anything about it, but while I'm human?" He snorted half-heartedly, knowing how limited what he was about to say truly was. Humans, Lupus Regina, sometimes feel anxiety or distaste at the thought of killing their own kind. Lupus Regina pursed her lips, careful not to frown. She instead raised a bright red eyebrow. "I never saw any of them hesitate, Master. I mean even the peasant toys out there are killing their own kind in a civil war now. And didn't we just kill a bunch of humans who invaded our home? Forgive my ignorance, Master, but what is the difference?" Ainz drank more slowly, buying himself time to think of how to answer her. "They were thieves and traitors. That's why I had the 3 slaves spared when CZ brought it up. They didn't want to do what they did, so they went wrong. But going out to the Katza Plains, I'll be essentially committing a massacre. Does that make sense?" Ainz asked, unsure if his idea of a difference was at all meaningful. "If you say it does, it does, and I just don't understand it." Lupus Regina scratched her head. Her yellow eyes looked up at him with reverence. "As I understand it, Master, kings do things for the greater good, or they're supposed to. If you've decided what the greater good is, and they're in the way, isn't killing them to get that way justified?" Ainz chuckled and put a mailed hand on Lupus Regina's head. He rubbed her affectionately, and she pressed her head into his palm with absolute contentment. "You may be right, Lupus Regina. I can make it quick, do it once, and I won't have to do it twice," Ainz told himself, and moved on to the other matter. He checked his stats to find his level. 150, plenty of skill points to allocate, but most of them need to go to warrior skills. I'll have to confess the truth to Albedo, Shaltia, and Demiurge soon. If they turn on me, he thought, and then briefly recalling that he could have the other guardians protect him from those 3, a vision came to mind with it. The children of my friends. Slaughtering each other. No. 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 That can never be allowed to happen. I won't let them kill me, but still better that end than to see my beloved children kill one another. Ainz resolved, then placed the now empty cup back on the tray. The threat of heartbreak was enough to drag him over to other matters. "Back to it," Ainz said with grit in his voice. "I have to be ready for anything, in this battle, or the one beyond it, if that should come to pass." "As you wish, Master," Lupus Regina said, and carried away the tray, steering clear while Ainz drew the heavy sword out of the sand again, and a summoned ice elemental appeared, towering above him, and standing as little chance as the fire elemental before it. Ainz put his helmet back on, yanking it tight, and began his attack. Volume 2 Chapter 39. "How many does that make now?" Henry asked as soon as she entered the tent. Her black dragon skin leather armor moved with her body when she ducked beneath the low entryway, and her companions were quick to answer. "Your husband just got back from Epespel this morning, my queen," Nina answered, giving a half bow and covering her heart with her hand. "So between that and the mining city of Eros to the north?" We now have 3 cities, 40 towns, and 300 villages of various sizes going as far west as 130 miles from Relo Bell. We're ready to move on to Elibera, and from there? Nina traced her hand along the map as Queen Henry approached and looked over it. It's a week-long march to the capital. They won't be waiting for you to take Elibera, the goblin strategist pointed out. His staff tapped the dirt beneath their feet. They've had weeks, and we've faced nothing but skirmishes. They'll fight for that city to keep from fighting at the capital itself. Henry brushed her long golden hair back over her shoulder. I think you're right. I'm not that good at these things. Yet. But I can't picture the king just letting us take another city. We're going to fight another pitched battle soon. Very soon, Nfur said when he entered the tent. Henry's serious face went bright with youthful happiness and she rushed into his embrace. The former shyness and newness of their affection was burned away and in its place was a conflagration of open passion between the pair. The warmth and heat of his body was little impeded by the magic armor either of them wore, but that was nothing in the face of the fiery kiss that they shared, or the tightness of their embrace. Welcome back, Henry said breathlessly when the kiss broke. Thank you, dear. Nfur grinned almost as sheepishly as he would have before everything went to hell. But his face quickly became serious. The Wolf Riders have reported the Riasti's king is on the way here. He has an army of 50,000 at his back. 50,000? That's a lot. Henry's mind was dizzy at the mere concept of so many people. I'm sure it would have been more, but when we started hanging nobles, they decided to take this seriously and move faster, even if it meant giving up numbers. Nina pointed out, it sounds worse than it is. A scythe is outnumbered by stalks of wheat, but what does it have to worry about? Can we take Elibera before they get there? Henry asked, and the table was silent. I don't think so. Nina finally acknowledged, we could take it, probably even easily, but I don't like arguing with stone walls, especially with an army on the way. I say we lead them away from the city, act like we're bypassing it to get to the capital. She traced her finger from Eros, over the plains away from the roads. They can't let us besiege it, so of course they'll get in the way, which is just fine. As long as Elibera isn't there to reinforce them, everything will be fine. Good. How soon can we go? Henry asked, resting her hands on the table and staring more down at the map than at her companions. My soldiers are worn out. Humans had to do most of the fighting at Epespel, so I'd give them a day of rest. Nfur suggested, if we can manage it, and I think we can as long as we send a small force ahead to prepare camp for us. Sounds good, let's do that then. Henry replied and slapped the table with the flat of her hand. Ramposa rocked slightly side to side atop his horse, his eyes steady ahead, while at his side, rode Gazif Stranov. My king, you've barely said anything this whole time, Gazif said. The king's dark, 1,000-yard stare set the head warrior on edge. Everything about His Majesty was in a stark contrast to the scene. Overhead, birds flew without a care, beasts fled at the sound of the army's approach, but the sun was warm and the air comfortable. The weather was in every way perfect for a walk, a ride, a hunt. Most of their recent days on the road had been like that. But the king's mood had always been the same. He said little to anyone, and would not even hold, let alone take counsel. What should I say, old friend? Ramposa III finally asked without looking over. Majesty? I don't know, Gazif said with a difficult swallow. Should I say that I miss my boys? That I think nightly of the warmth of their bodies, that I wonder what was done with them in death? Were they buried, or torn apart by beasts? Should I ask how did it come to this? And beg the four for an answer? Or should I ask what kind of king I was to let my kingdom come to this sorry state? Majesty, you did the best any man could do. Gazif quietly exclaimed, his wide-set eyes open as much as they could be while he looked at the king he admired. It wasn't enough, Gazif, and you know it. The theocracy tried to have you killed and nearly succeeded. My own nobility cooperated, and yet until the peasants started hanging nobles, nothing was done about it. I tried to raise my sons to value their kingdom, and I failed the one who should have succeeded me. My youngest daughter, I protected from marriage that might have helped my country. I put her first, and I was wrong for it. The king's rambling words were low and thick as blood with their bitterness. The empire was going to take my kingdom sooner or later. Even you couldn't have prevented that. King Ramposa III put a hand on Gazif's shoulder, but I know you would have tried, and for that I am grateful. But now I have one more task for you. Will you carry it out tonight after we make camp? Sire, Gazif replied, and seeing the blurry eyes beneath the gold-crowned helmet, he gave a humble, yes. Of course. Good. The king replied, and Gazif listened in disbelief to what his king had to say, but having given his word, he could think of nothing else to do but wait to do the unthinkable. 3 more days of marching carried the army of Khani southwest of Libera before scouts rushed word that the Riastai's army had been spotted. With that the army settled into the camp, their advanced riders prepared beforehand. That night, Nfaya was on top of Enri, each thrust of desire filling her body and driving spasms of pleasure throughout. She slid her thighs up against his side and wrapped her legs around him. Her arms reached out, to pull him into her embrace. Yes. Yes. Yes, Enri whispered into his ears when he was closer. She undulated her hips against his manhood and began to rake her nails over his skin. The powerful praise of their followers, to the king and queen of the wolves of Khani, was an aphrodisiac in and of itself. Success, power, and pleasure blended to become fuel for the fires of their shared desires, and the natural peak they both sought to become as one flesh in bliss was close. Then the flap of their tent was pushed open and Nina entered. "My queen. My king," she shouted, and immediately blushed and looked away. "What is it?" Enri shouted as her eyes flew open to see the sudden visitor. Nfaya turned to look over his shoulder to find the blushing Nina looking away and closing her eyes. "Forgive my interruption, but a visitor. An urgent one, someone you know. He has information for you," Nina hissed out urgently. Her eyes were bulging as soon as they opened, and though Enri and Nfaya traded mutual looks of regret, they could only sigh in exasperation. "Give us a moment to get dressed, and bring the guest in," Enri snapped, and Nina bade a hasty retreat. A moment later a hooded man escorted by 2 red-cap goblins ducked under the entry to the tent and then drew himself up to a towering height. Even though he was cloaked and hooded, both Nfaya and Enri realized that he was a virtual mountain of muscle that even if they stood up, they would still have to look up to. He threw back his hood, and bowed his head. "Good to see you, people of Khani," Gazif Stranov said, and pointing casually to the chair at the opposite end of the table he asked, "May I sit?" Gazif Stranov. "Of all the people I expected it to be. You weren't it," Enri said with more warmth than she herself thought to feel. "I haven't seen you since you tried to protect my village. Are you maybe having second thoughts about that decision now?" Gazif put his elbows on the table and folded his hands up to rest his chin on them. "I'd be lying if I said I never wondered if we wouldn't have been better off if you'd been killed. Certainly this rebellion wouldn't have happened, but if I could go back and do it again, I would make the same choice." "That's a fair answer," Nfaya added, "but the real question is, are you here to surrender?" "No," Gazif replied with resolve, "I'm here with information, an offer of exchange." "Exchange?" Enri asked, "What is it that you're offering, and what is it that you want?" "My king wants the bodies of his sons returned for proper burial. We heard about what Prince Barbaro did, and it grieves my king's heart. But the boy was still his son. He asks for both Barbaro's and Zaynak's bodies to be given over." "Well, we can give you Barbaro's body, what's left of it, or at least tell you where it is buried. But we had nothing to do with killing Prince Zaynak, he must have died before reaching us." Enri denied part of the request with a shrug. "What else?" "The second is that this battle be the end of our conflict. The king offers you independence, and all the land from Khani village, to Epespel to the south of us, and Ilibera to the northeast of us, including Irantal, will be yours," Gazif said, and both Enri and Nfaya's eyes opened wide as saucers. "Why fight at all then?" Nfaya asked. "We would take that offer now and go home." "Because we want something else from you, something tomorrow's fight would accomplish that even the king can't do on his own," Gazif said, and both Enri and Nfaya leaned forward with great interest. "About 1/4 of the kingdom just dropped into our laps, what could he want for that?" Enri wondered, and Gazif took out a piece of paper, which he laid out on the table. When he was done, Enri asked him point blank, "Do you swear on your honor as protector of the kingdom, as the royal head warrior, on the courage you showed at Khani, that this is not a trick or a trap?" "I swear it," Gazif said with a deep, long look into the eyes of the one he'd heard of as the Wolf Queen, "on all those things and anything else you can think of." Enri and Nfaya reflexively folded their hands together, fingers interlocked, uncertain still, each silently asking the other what to believe. Finally, Henri squeezed Nfuya's hand. Gazif waited in silence, and Nfuya spoke, "We have a bargain then. We'll see you on the field. And good luck out there," Henri said with a pitying downward look as the silent, broken-hearted warrior rose and made his exit after throwing the hood over his head again and ducking out of the tent exit. The peasant rebellion turned the generally quiet palace of Riestais into a virtual inn for the most powerful nobles and their families. The violence done by the Carnian rebels in hanging those nobles that fell into their hands sent shockwaves of terror through those on estates throughout the kingdom. More than that, the rebels of Carni, with their stunning successes, inspired other rebellions among discontented peasants who finally saw a chance to better their lives. At any other time such minor insurrections would have been easily crushed and the perpetrators drawn and quartered, but fear caused many a noble to flee to the well-fortified capital at the mere whisper of angry peasants. The royal family put the greatest houses up in guest rooms scattered about the palace, and at royal expense, rented out every single room in the best inns to provide space for the lesser nobility. True to form, even with everything on the line, they didn't stop playing their games of politics. Rena grew tired of them within a day, and left the daily operations in the hands of Marquis Revan. Which is why on this particular day, her room was tightly locked with only herself, Climb, and the members of Blue Rose settled in for a chat. The Golden Princess Rena, true to her reputation for sympathy, bowed her head deeply to Lake Hughes. "If the bowing of my head is not enough for you, I'll kneel," Rena said and dabbed her tear ducts with a white handkerchief. "No. Don't do that," Lake Hughes said, glancing at the door. "It isn't your fault, you aren't your brother, you didn't know." "No, I didn't, and if I had, I'd have had that idiot killed a long time ago. Endangering relations with the guild is a tier of stupidity I didn't know existed in this world." Rena swore and cursed her dead brother over and over again, but all of that was confined to her raging mind and did not touch her gentle face. "How are you holding up? Are you going to be okay? I know you and Prince Barbaro didn't get along, but weren't you on good terms with Prince Sainak?" Lake Hughes asked, and reached out to touch the shaking hand of her friend. "Yes, my other brother's death is unfortunate, but it's the natural result of the kingdom's policies. Kill an entire village over one noble, and you give another village a reason to rebel. We made sure they had nothing to lose and everything to gain. This was inevitable. My brother didn't deserve to die." "But people often get what they don't deserve, do they?" Rena asked, taking a long breath before picking up her teacup for a sip. "This isn't a social call, is it, Princess Rena?" Evil Eye asked, straightening up in her chair. "Evil Eye," Lake Hughes hissed. Rena tittered. "It's fine, Lake Hughes, she's not wrong. There's a business reason for you to be here too. I'll be honest, what my brother did was unforgivable. The guild refusing to defend my family's supporters, I understand it. But it goes deeper than that. None of this could have happened without the corruption of the factions of the Riestais kingdom." The lips of the members of Blue Rose tightened. There was no reason to argue with what she said, everyone knew it. Father's final wish before leaving was to end all that. So many pitiable girls, children, young men. So many ruined lives. My family can't possibly make this right, and we not only let this happen, some of us were part of it. Tears began to flow freely down Rena's cheeks. "I need your help to do this. It's not a normal job, not at all, but it'll be the easiest one you've ever done." "Princess Rena," Lake Hughes began, "the guild is apolitical." "Good, so is this," Rena said. "Climb, bring me that sheaf of papers over on my end table, would you?" Climb inclined his head and obeyed. He took them up and brought them over, and the radiant blue-eyed princess gestured for him to hand the papers to Lake Hughes. The radiant adventurer took them in hand and began to skim through the words on there. As she did, flipping from one to the next, she felt her heart skip a beat. "These are all arrest warrants?" Lake Hughes asked, laying the documents down. "No. Only half, the rest are title revocations. All I'm asking is for your help in arresting everyone on that list." Rena replied, "We'll put them on public trial immediately, while father is away." "But..." Lake Hughes froze, but before she could unfreeze and speak, Evil Eye began to laugh. "Yes. Absolutely yes." The diminutive magic caster clapped her hands together in excitement. "Shorty?" Gagrin gasped. "What?" "This has been a long time coming, and for the first time in who knows how long, they're all together. We can end it all in one blow, Evil Eye snapped the fingers of her right hand with a decisive motion. Lakes looked around at her sisters. I won't engage in assassination. But the arrest of dangerous suspects? Well, they're not nobles, so that should be a thin enough objection to satisfy the guild, especially given the recent events. Thank you, Lakes, Evil Eye, everyone. The kingdom will be a very different place after tonight. Princess Rena said with a contented little smile. I can hardly wait. She added, and took another sip of tea. Volume 2 Chapter 40. King Ramposa III drew himself up at the front of his army. At the head of each of them stood a freshly appointed young man personally selected by Gazif Stranov. Across him stood an army not but 20% the size of his own force. And I still have no chance. The Carnian wolves are equipped with magic weapons that can penetrate steel, they have armor that stops our spears, they have trolls that heal absurdly fast, goblins and wolves that tear through horses and men like a sword through wet paper. Good. That will do for this. The king thought, and the drums began to sound. The whole of the Riastai's army began to advance. Majesty, I will protect you. I promise, Gazif said to his aged king. Today, protect yourself. The king ordered, and Gazif fell silent. The king drew his sword, and Gazif drew his own. They watched as the wolf riders began to advance. Relief swept over the king. This will work. He realized, and for the first time in some time, Gazif saw a genuine sense of peace come over the face of the heavily armored warrior king. Glories of old passed before the closed eyes of the old King Ramposa, memories of battles won, the brotherhood of banners that was once shared, the happy moment that filled his heart with joy when his sons and daughters were born, the thoughts he wanted to have most, he had, and they set his skin tingling. He raised up his sword, and Gazif raised up his. The wolf riders were close, the magic casters were moving into position and covered by infantry. Ramposa braced himself, and then he heard it. Ha-ah-ah-alt. It wasn't the only voicing of the command, but even where it couldn't be heard, the fruits of it could be seen. All along the line, units led by Gazif's chosen, stopped dead in their tracks. King Ramposa gave no such order. Instead, he lowered his sword, and shouted, Charge! With the vigor of youth that Gazif had never seen, the old man spurred his horse forward. The rest of the unit, not knowing what was afoot, followed. Countless nobles, their most elite and loyal guards. And no one else. Gazif heard the drums of the Wolf Queen and her king, and saw them give their own orders. Spells launched into the air and began to explode. Screaming nobles and their retainers fell to ruin. Some bore a look of shock on their faces, others never understood that they were dying. The wolf riders wheeled about and began to surround the unit. Gazif desperately swung his sword within the maelstrom as the magic died and weapons meant to kill him came closer. Halberds belonging to heavy goblin infantry thrust out. It was a forest of sharp points that were being steadily thrust from the front, and the old feeling of pain began to fill his body. Screams of nobles and their retainers swallowed the space between men, horses, and those who killed both. The grass was cast aside for dirt, and dirt became mud as the unit became ever more tightly pressed. I will defend my king, Gazif roared like a beast when he saw his lord continue his advance. A quick look showed that the rest of the army still had not moved. Forward! King Ramposa declared, rearing his horse back, its hooves kicking furiously, his sword aloft and white hair billowing. Age was taking its toll on his body. His movements were slowed, but his voice still had the power of youth. The goblins, and the humans who began to fall in on the left, now had the unit completely surrounded. Gazif dodged a halberd thrust, swept in, and swung his blade, cutting the weapon in half, but the bearer in heavy dark armor drew a sword, while another halberd bearer filled the gap. Forward! The king's voice boomed, but there was no going forward. A halberd thrust struck the horse in its noble pale breast, and it fell on its side, kicking and whinnying in agony as it tried to dislodge the deeply lodged halberd from its already dying body. The king, unhorsed, fell on his side, and even over the din and chaos of the dying nobles and retainers around him, Gazif heard the break of bones. Forward! King Ramposa shouted, weaker at last, his sword wobbling in his hands. Gazif flung his body in between the king and the attackers. How can they be so strong? They're goblins. Gazif wondered as wounds began to find his body. Get out of here. Ramposa finally uttered other words, but as there were no living bodies around him, only the dead, Men fell on their backs, sides, and bellies, some still clutching wounds where armor should have saved them and did not. Gazif swung his sword with all the skill of a desperate novice, battering away blows that fell with constancy and steadiness of rain, and like drops of rain, he couldn't stop everyone and wounds began to pile up on his body. Gazif's wild eyes darted around, there was no one left to protect, and nowhere left to go. Wolves were already feasting on horse flesh at his back, and humans leveled long spears to hem him in, but the warrior captain had no intention of fleeing. King Ramposa's lips were moving, but no sound was coming out, at least none that Gazif could hear. Frustration and anger overflowed throughout his body, and he abandoned the king's last order, disobeying his lord for the first time in his life. His feet squelched in the bloody mud, a rope of unfortunate intestines was ripped further out of the belly of its dead or dying owner when he spun around to stop another piercing strike. And then it hit, a single piercing blow, as the last of his martial arts ran out, as the last of his strength began to fade, a halberd ran through his body from one side to the other, tearing open kidneys, liver, and stomach. "I will protect my king," he said through blood-foaming lips, and a halberd pierced his chest, came out the other side, and pinned both he and King Ramposa III to the ground, where they died, with Gazif's corpse still trying to protect his king, and his sword in nerveless fingers that somehow, still did not open to let loose their grip. Getting nobles drunk was easy. Getting confident nobles drunk was easier. Getting frightened nobles drunk was easiest. The servants of the royal family kept the wine bottles coming out, and from where she sat at her father's place at the table, she raised her glass again and again in toast. "To victory," she said, and they drank. "To the kingdom," she shouted, and they drank more. "To the future." And she would raise her cup again, and they would drink with her. But where they drank wine Rena had drugged, the princess herself drank only pressed juice. The rich full flavor was, to her, better than wine anyway, with a tart sweetness that she only barely suppressed her urge to indulge in too often. "A little bonus this evening, I get to have all of it I want." That in and of itself was enough to keep her smile warm and genuine. The wine flowed like a river, and in it, nobles chose to swim and drown. One by one they began to pass out as the evening wore on, their cheers and the loud cacophony of their private heaven became as tranquil and quiet as a monastery, little by little. Rena looked out one of the high windows. In the darkness beyond, she caught sight of the full moon shining down, and then straightened her back. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught sight of her watchful bodyguard. "I wonder how father is faring out there? Has he engaged already?" It was an idle thought she quickly brushed off, then she winked at Clement. He gave a sharp nod and addressed a guard that promptly left the room. The heavy footfalls of the palace guard trotting up the stairs was an unexpected sound to those revelers still awake enough to recognize the sound, but not sober enough to comprehend it. The Golden Princess stood with back straight as Climb approached and leaned over to whisper, "It's done, Princess Rena." Rena tapped her glass one more time, and weary, bleary heads raised to look at her. "It's been a wonderful evening, and now, if you'll hear me out, there are things that need to be said that have gone unsaid for far too long." Rena put her hand behind her back and folded it into a fist. Her sense of hatred and contempt for the nobles that provided the maids as veritable spies for their houses and invaded her life, began to boil. Her knuckles cracked a little with the force of her fist, and she began. "In times of peace and tranquility, you proved adequate in taking care of my family's kingdom. Barely adequate. But whenever any disturbance arose, any trouble or trial or threat, you forgot your duty to my family, our kingdom and its people. Instead you looked out for something else." She paused and let the words hang. The more clever and slightly less drunk, began to sense danger and tried to move, inhibited by the mild additional dosing given to them. "You protected your lands, your names, your titles, your interests. You put yourselves first, many of you, I know, engaged with 8 fingers, openly using your peasants to grow the plant that was turned into black dust. Or selling off your peasants as if the anti-slavery measures hadn't passed. Those very actions caused the rebellion that my father has had to go attend to. When it came to the Baharuth Empire, you often sold out information on one another or the royal family. In every way you could be a failure in difficult times, you were failures." Rena paused again and took a sip of juice. The flavor exploded on her tongue, its darkness bringing happiness that kept her smile growing as she laid out words long held back. "In every way you could be corrupt, you were corrupt. As of today, every corrupt, disloyal, faithless, or incompetent house has its land and titles officially revoked. You will be replaced by competent people. Your fortunes are forfeit, and for most of you, so are your lives. Rena then flung her glass down hard against the floor, shattering into 1,000 shards pointed at the guests, and shouted, "Guards! Seize them!" Chaos ensued as those unconscious failed to understand that their lives as they knew them were over, while those awake enough to understand the changing of their world, struggled to resist, and failed. Rena watched with Climb at her side, as nobles were dragged, sometimes by their feet, clawing at the stone floor until their fingernails tore off, crying for mercy that didn't exist, or protesting innocence that both Rena and Climb knew they didn't possess. Upstairs, Evil Eye ran through the halls faster than the eyes of mere common noble guards could hope to see. A part of the adventurer pitied the guards, but it was only a tiny part. They are no different than Eight Fingers thugs, and some of them are probably exactly that. And so as she went down the hall, her vampiric claw came out and throat after throat from guard after guard standing outside of door after door, opened up and spurted an arc of bright red blood out onto the once clean, cream-colored floor. As one man fell, another would turn to see the commotion, but before that could happen, her finger tore its dread arc over the veins of the men who waited to die, and the noise of their tumbling armored bodies, loud as thunder for a second or two each, went through the hall, only to be reduced to twitching and gurgling, then nothing. On other floors her sisters would be doing the same, dispatching the most trusted guards of the most powerful nobles as if they were but trash monsters beneath even novice adventurers to kill. For the twins, it was a trivial chore. They would fade through shadows and thrust their daggers through armored backs as if the only armor they wore was a cheap shirt. For Lake Hughes, sending out her flying blades took an entire hall before the last managed to catch a glimpse of his inevitable death. Within an hour, Gagram was doing her part, leading the palace guards from room to room. All it took from the giant swaggering woman was one jab of the butt of her hammer and doors popped off hinges. Cries of fear and outrage, including the unfortunate shrieks of children who didn't understand why men with swords and spears were breaking into their dark rooms and dragging away their mothers or fathers, overflowed into the death-filled and blood-stained halls. Within an hour, the palace was purged. Rena looked over the now empty table. The goblets lay toppled, glasses and bottles shattered, wine spilled over, dripped to the floor. The wet smack of drops of fine Aristide's red falling into a puddle was the only sound in the great hall. "Climb?" Rena said without turning from the sight of overturned chairs and spilled plates. "Yes, my princess?" Climb said, immediately at her side and with one eye turned toward her. Princess Rena faced him directly and with eyes pooling with tears that made her naturally blue eyes seem all the deeper. "Climb. Have the children removed from their parents. Separate the families. But please, be gentle. We can't risk any kind of mass escape." "As you wish, princess," Climb said with stoic resolve. "She's so merciful and kind. Even giving a practical order just breaks her heart. I must protect her, at any cost," he resolved as he left her side to carry out her orders. When the palace was secure and Climb was gone, Rena took the folded paper from within her sleeve, went down to one of the lower floor guardhouses. In the dim candlelight that cast her shadow about the room, she passed the folded, sealed paper over. "See this to the captain of the city guard. Place it only in his hands." "My princess." "Of course." The guard shot to his feet and shot out his response. Illiteracy has its uses. Rena kept the somewhat repugnant thought to herself as she watched the common soldier scurry up the stairs. "He won't read it, though I should consider transferring or eliminating the captain of the guard. I can't very well risk having Climb learn I sent out an order saying, 'Kill the rest' after all." In darkness of the night, the reserved homes for minor nobles, and temporarily borrowed inns, were hit by rank after rank of Riesti's city guards. Screams were few as stealth was a priority, but when panic set in, the old died first, the young hid, the cowardly fled, the brave fought, the weak froze and all, in time, joined the old. When dawn came, Princess Rena went to the throne room of the Riesti's kingdom. There sat her father's chair, his place of power for decade upon decade. Empty. Alone. With her. The golden Princess Rena stepped up on the slightly raised platform on which it lay, turned around, smoothed her dress back, and as the golden sun streamed into the hall of the kingdom, the princess sat on the throne,